Hello, everyone. President Sunday here. I am joined by Matt McManus, professor at. Forgive me. What university are you professor at again? Oh God, I'm doing that again. Quiet you. All right. Sorry about that. So I'm joined by Professor Matt McManus. You are a professor of political theory, international relations, or?
Yeah, politics and international relations at Tec de Monterrey. Although I'm moving on to becoming professor of politics at Whitman College as of September, which is a private liberal arts school in Washington State.
Oh, congratulations. So this is going to be a little bit off. Oh, sorry about that. You kind of warbled there a little bit.
Oh, I said we'll be neighbors, at some point.
So just in terms of format, this is going to be a little bit off the cuff. I think we're just going to discuss for about 15 or so minutes, and then anybody in the audience who has questions, feel free, and we'll just sort of have a back and forth kind of casually, and we'll see how that goes. So I guess just to get us started, obviously the title of this is a little bit, well, it's interesting. The rise of postmodern conservatism. Would you be able to sort of elucidate for us a little bit what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that there are two ways of understanding postmodernism. One is the more popular way, particularly in a lot of right-wing discourse, although the general media tends to adopt the stance also, and is that postmodernism is a predominantly French philosophy or theoretical perspective. It has iterations of art, pure philosophy, language, and so on. And generally speaking, what postmodern theory is about is demonstrating skepticism towards established values and epistemic systems. And that's to a certain extent true. You can find people who situate themselves nicely into this kind of understanding of postmodernity. Somebody like, for instance, Jacques Derrida, in some of his moments, Michel Foucault, Gayatri Spivak, all of them develop various skeptical theories that are of interest, although I also think limited in the way most iterations of skepticism always fundamentally are, going all the way back to ancient skepticism. The way that I understand postmodernism, though, is as a cultural condition that we inhabited now for about the last 50, 60 years, that finds its roots in the paradigm of modernity. And postmodern culture has had a ubiquitous influence on the way that modern individuals or contemporary individuals understand themselves and understand their politics, in particularly their identity within various different political systems. And what I argue in the book is that postmodern conservatism is the kind of reactionary politics you would expect to see in neoliberal societies with postmodern cultures.
And I think, just to interject there, I think I've actually neglected to mention the title of the book. So you just released a book. This is The Rise of Postmodernism.
The rise of modern conservatism. Yeah.
The rise of postmodern conservatism. I apologize for that. All right. So, okay. So that's very interesting. So, a postmodern conservative, then. What is the difference between it, or if there is one today? What is the difference between a conservative simpliciter and a postmodern conservative?
Well, a conservative is a more general categorization, right? To a certain extent, there's a lot of ambiguity about what it means, even in right-wing circles. So some people would say that a conservative is just somebody who has a skeptical view about change, or they want to preserve things more or less the way they are, and allowing certain changes to take place if necessary. Other people take a more expansive view and say that conservatism is just anyone who happens to be on the political right. And one of the things that I point out in my book is that if you look at what's broadly called the conservative tradition, there are strands or iterations of conservatism that were amenable to mutation under the conditions of postmodernity into the contemporary form that we see with postmodern conservatism. And postmodern conservatism is a more distinct kind of conservatism that, as I said, has emerged within recent years as a result of the strange features of our postmodern culture. It has its own distinct qualities, while at the same time demonstrating a certain continuity with these earlier strands of conservatism that go deeper back in the tradition.
Okay, so they still retain sort of the conservative character, but a postmodern conservative is a conservative who sort of takes as their points of contact problems that emerge specifically in. You seem to be using postmodern, not like you use it as a cultural condition, but it also seems to there seems to be something of it seems to refer to a period as well. So, because you specify the last 50 or 60 years, so I guess here's what I would wonder then: what is the thread? If you had to isolate, what is the dominant thread that connects these sort of mutations of conservatism to the conservatism prior?
Well, the biggest and most important one is intense skepticism towards the rationalistic claims of liberalism and of what's sometimes characterized as universal reason. And you see the thread going back to the work of people like Edmund Burke, Joseph de Maistre, through to individuals like Michael Oakeshott, Robert Bork, Lord Patrick Devlin. And the kind of contention that all of them have is that we need to be very skeptical of the claim of liberal rationalists to understand the world accurately the way it is. And the reason we need to be skeptical of those claims is they pose a threat to tradition and to the established order. And in juxtaposition to universal reason and his claims, what we want to emphasize is the way that things have been done. And these shouldn't be subjected to scrutiny. They should be accepted because when they're subjected to scrutiny, it risks destabilizing the fabric that we all depend upon. And there are more or less extreme iterations of this position. Edmund Burke, for example, has a very moderate approach to these kinds of issues, where he was open to liberal reforms and he was open to the claims of universalistic reason. But he also likes to emphasize that, look, reason alone can't build a society. We also need to depend on tradition, and in particular, as he put it, the prejudices of ordinary people and elites, for that matter. More virulent strains can be seen in the work of somebody like Joseph de Maistre, who used to characterize reason as fundamentally a destructive force. It undermined faith in throne and altar. It brought about the French Revolution. People didn't know their place anymore because they saw fit to question things that previously were taken for granted. And therefore, what we need is this very reactionary turn back to a more dogmatic age. And one of the things that I argue is none of these is distinctively postmodern in their orientation, but they were amenable to mutation under the conditions of postmodernity to the kind of skepticism of contemporary liberal reason that we see figures like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or even in some moments Nigel Farage express.
So that's very interesting. So now obviously de Maistre would be the stronger of the two influences here. Now when I think though of sort of modern of what you call postmodern conservative movements that are not of the establishment, let's say, like we're clearly not talking about the GOP. We may be talking about Trump, or we may be talking about sort of reactionaries on the internet. But what sort of defines these ones is that these are, whatever else may be said about them, these are very independent thinkers. These are people for whom the private use of their reason is very, it's very much a characterizing part. They generally aren't part of some established or at the very least they're certainly not pro the current established institutions at their time. They're almost revolutionary in a sense. Can you help us understand that a little bit? Like I for myself, I find that very contradictory. You see a movement or a cluster of movements that is in large measure largely anti-democratic, or at least largely anti-liberal. Yet it assumes, when you observe it, the form it takes is both historically and structurally dependent upon a liberal understanding of the individual subject. Any thoughts, please? It's
No, but I mean, the kind of contradictions you've talked about have always been inherent in many different strains of conservatism, right? If you want, the commentator Corey Robin pointed this out exceptionally well in his book, The Reactionary Mind, which has had a second edition that was released talking about the Trump phenomenon. Because one of the things about human existence, of course, is that change isn't just inevitable. It's always happening, right? It's not going to happen. It's happening now. And for conservatives who have a vested interest in trying to maintain things the way they are, particularly established order and hierarchical structures, what that means is that you can't just ever say we want things to stay the same. What you need to say is that we need to go back, or we need to change things in order to bring back to some pre-established harmony that existed before, that now only exists in our cultural imaginary. And so you'll see more radical strains of conservatism start to emerge, particularly as they move increasingly distant from the time period that they idealize or fetishize. Okay? Now, what I say about postmodern conservatism and what makes it distinct is that often the kinds of people who are attracted to postmodern conservatism, understandably in some respects, are individuals who grew up in postmodern cultures. They don't have a firm sense of their identity, either individually or collectively. And so the past in these kinds of circumstances can become something like a library of different options about who they can define themselves as and what kind of identity, as a collective identity, they can associate with. The problem is, of course, that they don't actually have these kinds of identities to begin with. They need to be constructed through a process of nostalgically interpreting them and then trying to reinvent them in the context of 21st century postmodernity. And so what you often see postmodern conservatives do is invent this pastiche-like identity that's assembled out of the museum of the past, using various different tropes, many of which are mutually contradictory, but provide them with a sense of stability and a sense of meaning in a world that seems increasingly chaotic and in which the authority that they think they should enjoy is increasingly being disrupted by usually progressive figures.
So a postmodern conservative then isn't necessarily someone who sort of occupies a specific part of the political landscape. What's sort of intrinsic in that is sort of how they come to occupy that, or what's motivating them specifically. So Yeah,
exactly. And I should point this out that many conservatives have been aware that this is a characteristic of conservatism going way back. I mean, Russell Kirk probably expressed it best when he said conservatism isn't about having a fixed ideology. It's about a disposition or an attitude that someone has towards life. And this is also important when it comes to postmodern conservatism, right? Postmodern conservatism don't necessarily believe one thing or another. It depends on the country that they're in. It depends on what they mine to create their pastiche-like sense of identity. It depends upon what's going on in the world at any given point. What matters is the disposition or attitude that they take, the sense that they need a sense of collective identity and individual identity. That can't be done by creatively establishing a new identity. It has to be found in the past. And this sense as well that the reason why the identities that they create don't seem as stable as they should be is because there's an antagonistic, progressive, or liberal force out there that's constantly trying to undermine their authority.
Yet ironically, it seems that, and as you indicate by the title of your book, that they are indeed establishing a new kind of identity that has no precedent. So that's very interesting. I just want to quickly address the audience. So our guest here is a little bit pressed for time today. So feel free to ask questions whenever you like, and we'll try and squeeze them in. There's not going to be a formal question time. We're just going to keep going back and forth. And yeah, so just wanted to say that. So again, thank you very much. I found that really interesting when you were talking about that sort of that pastiche identity. It rings true a lot about myself, sort of just out of high school. I remember I was sort of flirting with the idea of joining the Catholic Church, and the reason why I didn't is because on reflection, I recognized that what it was doing for me, I wasn't finding the theology satisfying. I wasn't finding. There were a whole bunch of things that made me uneasy about it, but they were also the same things that gave it appeal. That is, you were now a part of this this majestic organization with a storied history, with a really distinct aesthetic. You're occupying a particular place in the world by being a part of it. It gives you a sense of reality, of actually having like a sort of being a part of the cast of the world story, if you will. And I found that really interesting. What do you think of the what do you project is going to be the future of this development going forward?
First off, that I sympathize with what you're talking about, right? And I'm not trying to say that the quest to find some kind of identity or construct some kind of identity is bad, right? Or that you should just accept living in conditions of constant instability and constant anomie about who you are and what kind of collective identity you happen to be inhabiting, right? What concerns me about postmodern conservatism is the fact, well, it's twofold. The first is that I don't think that the people are constructing what's sometimes characterized by people like Kierkegaard as an authentic identity. They are not sitting there struggling to figure out who it is that they are. They want easy answers by mining the past for authority figures and identities that they think seem kind of like them, and then they reconstruct them as this pastiche, ignorant of or indifferent to the contradictions that are entailed in the construction of this pastiche. And then they just kind of roll with it. The other thing that I don't like about postmodern conservatism is, again, also this antagonistic approach that it takes for the world. Once they construct this pastiche-like sense of identity, then there's this deep feeling that it's constantly under threat and that it's an existent thing that once occupied a privileged place in society that's since been undermined. And then they tend to blame leftists and progressives and women and LGBTQ and people and migrants and so on for taking that away from them. And I think if you actually look at the history of what's happened and of these movements, that's not at all true. And postmodern conservatism is a danger to a lot of people because it can be very tempting, given this kind of disposition, for people to turn to authoritarian or highly cruel policies as a way of trying to stabilize this pastiche that they've constructed by taking away rights and privileges from other people, which is something that I think you fundamentally should not do under almost any circumstance.
Or even just as a part of the identity itself, like it's a part of its expression. It's not necessarily pragmatically deployed. Yeah.
I mean, at its worst, antagonism can in itself become a very important part of someone's identity, and I think you see this in certain people, for instance, who much of who they are is built up with being part of the Republican Party, for example. This is something I see a lot in discourse online, right? Who they are is bound up with being a quote-unquote conservative. And that, of course, to them means disliking Democrats and disliking the left and disliking liberals. And you have to think that, if that's all that you are and everything that you have going for you, that's a very worrying and problematic thing.
Yeah, that's interesting what you were saying about the picking and choosing. One of the things that I've run into in my engagements with this community, is that what's interesting is that there's a lot of engagement with classical texts, or if you want to call them classical texts, but they aren't selected in the way in which, like, somebody pursuing a degree in philosophy, for example, would encounter these texts. That is, they're sort of didactically presented to them so that they understand not just the content and isolation of a particular book, but also what they're engaging with, sort of what the moves are from then and now that this thing represents a moment in. It seems like the move is, we are antagonistic to this. Let's go online. Let's find writers that are antagonistic to this, and let's get read up on these. And so you have this constellation of writers who have very tenuous relations to each other, who are being sort of put forward almost as an alternate canon. And I find that really interesting.
It is really interesting. And I mean, I think the best articulation of this is the emergence of classical liberalism as one identity that many of these people tend to inhabit. And the thing is, if you actually look at what a lot of people who identify as classical liberals now actually believe, it has very little bearing to what somebody like Locke or Tocqueville or John Stuart Mills would actually espouse. There's usually a lot of identitarianism embedded in it. There's a little bit of nationalism. There's tremendous amount usually of kind of mythologizing, but I can see why the identity would be appealing to people and why they would try to associate themselves with this canon, because what they really latch onto is the idea that once upon a time there were these figures, they have an auspicious place in our history, they value things like free speech, and the left and progressives are trying to take that away from us by undermining things like free speech, right? So that becomes the trope they affiliate with, and they identify as classical liberals, and all the rest of the tradition is kind of ignored, but that becomes the singular most important thing that they need to identify with.
All right, so I'm just going to ask some questions for you from the audience here.
Sure.
So Noah,
I ask, who's your picture, by the way? I never asked that.
Oh, who is my picture? Are you familiar with G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday?
I am, yeah.
Okay, well, I had a friend who was an artist a long time ago, back when I was in sort of the whole apologetics new atheist thing. And I had this weird idea of sort of getting involved in that under this name, which I didn't, thank God. But I suggested to her the character, and she said, okay, give me a photograph of your face. All right. And she sort of made her own interpretation. That's hand painted.
Yeah, no, it's very nice. Yep.
Yeah.
I know that's neither here nor there, but I just realized I don't know if I'll get another opportunity to ask that question. So.
No, a lot of people have been asking me that. People seem to think it's John Hamm for some reason. But anyway, so to the questions. Noah Watson asks, is this identity necessarily a pastiche? I know it almost always is, but can it exist as a stripping back of the forces that distorted this previous identity instead?
Yeah, I mean, this raises some very serious questions about what it means to have an authentic identity, right? And there are many different ways that people can build an authentic identity. And there's many different ways that people could even build an authentic conservative identity. One of the ways that I've seen this accomplished, of course, is by people forming a genuine attachment to a religious tradition and an onto-theological tradition and committing themselves to that very strongly. And of course, that entails sacrifices as well, as any kind of a genuine identity or authentic identity construction does. Because when you decide that you're going to be something, that necessarily closes off other doors and other possibilities of what you could potentially be, right? And if you decide, for example, to become a conservative Catholic, to go back to an example that was brought up before, you're closing off certain moral and human experiences that you could have in order to commit yourself to something that has a long and austere history to it. Right? But the thing about postmodern conservatives is often they don't want to engage in the really hard work that's entailed by authentic identity construction. And that's why they settle for a pastiche, because a pastiche is where you can bring things together that don't necessarily fit together and try to have it every which way. You know, claim to be a classical liberal who believes in freedom, but at the same time claim to be a nationalist who wants closed borders and to prevent immigrants from coming in. And, claim to be somebody who doesn't believe in God because you're too rational and secular and too devoted to logic and reason for that, but nonetheless be a cultural Christian who thinks that people should espouse traditional values, particularly when it comes to things like sexual relations and relations between genders, right?
Can I address another question to that sort of? Do you
Sure.
Because what this is bringing to mind is this is almost evocative of the way in which some people sort of adopt, and I know I'm going to botch this, but like communist or Marxist or what have you as an identity, well outside of actually being well versed in sort of, the history of Marxist or Marxian thought. So this certainly doesn't seem like just a right-wing phenomena, what you're describing. Yeah.
No, I don't think it is at all. And I mean, this is one of the things about postmodernity being a cultural condition, right? There are left-wing iterations of postmodern politics. In fact, I would say that left-wing iterations of postmodern politics were the first to emerge, right? And the thing about left-wing iterations of postmodern politics is they were more willing to embrace or accept the idea that identity in this cultural condition is inherently going to be destabilized. But the claim of these kinds of movements was this is actually an opportunity for us to construct new identities or agitate for a reconceptualization of who we're going to be politically by including other groups that have traditionally been marginalized or whose voices haven't been heard. right? So there was kind of a positive spin on this. Postmodern conservatives also tend to engage in this process of identity creation under unstable conditions, but the attitude they take is quite different.
Jalma Bayorn asks, would another way of framing the problem of postmodern conservatism be that it operates in a post hoc way combined with employing essentialism where it's not mandated?
I think that's exactly right. And this is one of the things that you see characterizing not just postmodern conservatism, but conservatism generally, right? If you look at people like Eben Burke, or especially people like Joseph de Maistre, they were very willing to deploy epistemic skepticism towards the rationalistic values of universal liberalism, right? And they would deploy every form of skepticism under the book. But when it came time to things like the Christian identity that de Maistre himself associated with, well, then that skepticism goes out the window, because it's necessary to commit yourself to this in order to maintain both your sense of self and to maintain the political and onto-theological order that's so necessary, in his view, for human flourishing, right? And postmodern conservatism is very similar, right? Where these people will be highly skeptical of the claims of universal reason if that's necessary for political purposes. Probably the most obvious example is a lot of them are very skeptical that man-made climate change is a thing. But then when it comes to the dogmas that are essential for them to maintain their sense of a stable identity, well, then that skepticism evaporates out the window, because it's necessary for them to believe this in order to hold on to the world and their sense of self that they need so desperately.
Right. Which is not to say, again, not to put words into your mouth, but this doesn't seem to me to imply that these people were in some sense being insincere, or were sort of in some overt sense motivated towards maintaining something in a dishonest fashion. No.
I don't think these people are dishonest, right? I mean, all of us construct our identities in some senses on our sense of self out of what's going on in the world around us, and we don't necessarily do this in a consistent way. It just happens through a number of biological and psychological processes, right? What I think is interesting about postmodern conservatism is the fact that this is very much a conscious activity without necessarily being a reflective activity, right? People are actively going out there saying, I don't know who I am. I need to find an identity or construct one for myself, but they don't reflect very much about what would be needed to make that identity something authentic. What they're just looking for is something that makes them feel content and like they live in an ordered world, right? Which is an abandonment of the challenges that would normally be associated with this quest to develop a conscious but also a reflective identity and sense of self.
That very much resonates with my experience. If I had a critique with the reactionary groups that I've encountered, it's largely, again, it's not the positions, it's the general attitude towards different ideas. There isn't an openness generally towards taking these things at their best and actually evaluating them, and perhaps even assuming just as a matter of course, so you can evaluate them as honestly as possible, that maybe there are things about them that you don't know and you need to sort of engage in them in a deeper sense for a while before you can make a final judgment, things like that. It very much seems to be we need to make decisions about what we can use for X or what we can't, and it needs to be made now. And so there's an inability to sort of engage intellectually honestly. But I'll just ask a few more questions. I don't know how much time you have left at this point.
I'm going to play another 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes? Okay, great. So we'll just go through a few questions then, just so nobody feels left out. Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. How can we go about authentic identity construction, in your opinion?
I mean, that's a very good question, right? And it goes well beyond the purview of my initial book, right? I think the best answer was given by somebody like Soren Kierkegaard, right? In particular, if you look at his book, Either or Stages on Life's Way. And he says, that many of us struggle to develop a sense of who we are that feels true to our deepest convictions. But we know that we're on the right path, not when things get easier, but when things get harder, right? When we have to make difficult choices about what it is that we choose to believe, and recognize that once we make that choice, certain possibilities are going to fall away from us, right? When I make the choice to be somebody who's sincerely committed to being a family man, for example, right? Certain possibilities fall away from me, right? And when I make a commitment to being the best possible academic I can be, right? Certain possibilities fall by the wayside that I might have pursued under different circumstances, right? And what I think is problematic about postmodern conservatism is that it's not about making things harder for people. It's about making it easier, because what these people want more than anything else is stability, and authenticity is not about stability. It's often very challenging, very hard, and it only gets harder the more you become a person that's an individual of integrity.
So just to particularize it a little further then, so with sort of the current spread of reactionary movements that we see today, and of course a lot of them are subterranean, so it's hard to say exactly what we're talking about when we talk about them. But in your view, because again, the critique is largely with a mode of sort of reflexive attitude towards new information and a general unreflectiveness. Can these be salvaged to be something good, in your opinion?
It's possible, right? I mean, I've been giving a little bit more thought to that recently. So Nate Hockman, who is an author from the National Review, very smart, very interesting young author, does identify as a conservative, and he's actually writing a critique of my book that should be published with Ariel magazine soon, saying that he thinks I'm actually right, but his argument is, why give that such a negative spin, right? Why look at this as a bad thing? Maybe it's something interesting and useful that conservatives are now engaging in this conscious process of drawing a pastiche-like sense of identity, and maybe this can rejuvenate our sense of the past in some way. I don't think that that's true for the reason I described with the earlier question, but I'm open to being convinced in some circumstances. What I really dislike most poignantly, I should say, is again, not necessarily this process of identity creation, but the political consequences for groups that become marginalized by the antagonistic attitude that this sometimes generates, and the propensity to support authoritarian figures that many postmodern conservatives can succumb to. Right? Trump, and in particular, people like Viktor Orban or Jair Bolsonaro. Right? I think that's a really bad thing to do, and it harms people, and it harms the most vulnerable people, actually.
Do you have time for 2 more questions, let's say?
Sure, 2 more.
Okay, cool. So Dilvani asks, what do you make of the Bugman critique the right makes against their enemies? Do you think it plays into this issue with the authenticity of identity?
Could you tell me what do you mean by the Bugman critique?
Okay, so I'm not actually sure of the source of this, but there's this sort of meme going around. You know about the NPC meme, of course, I'm sure.
The NPC meme? No, I don't.
Okay, well, basically referring to,
when it comes to some of this stuff.
Let's say referring to the modern liberal, it's an internet meme, referring to the modern liberal subject, let's say, as this unawakened sort of passive bovine creature with no purpose or what have you. So one form of this is the you'll see this phrase, the small-souled bugman. Something like that. Yeah, there's an essay called "The Rise of the Small-Souled Bugman" or something along those lines. So we can sort of broaden it out a little bit. The general critique of people who are not reacting, let's say, against modernity or against our current condition or what have you.
Well, okay. I should say, okay, I think I do get that, right? This critique has been leveled for, quite frankly, centuries, right? And there are iterations of it going all the way back to Locke's debate with Robert Filmer, right? Where various Christian commentators used to say that, well, modern liberals have no soul, they don't feel the way that we do about existence because we have a deeper connection to it due to our fundamental relation with God. And you see other critics emerging in the 19th century characterizing liberalism as a philosophy for pigs, something that John Stuart Mill famously responded to. And then through the 20th century, you have individuals like Heidegger, who famously castigated capitalism, liberalism, and communism as being metaphysically the same and committed to a life of inauthenticity and so on. And I think the response to that is always to point out that, yes, it is entirely possible for people living in liberal polities and capitalist societies to be inauthentic, to be spineless, soulless creatures just committed to the hedonistic pursuit of desire. But I don't think that's any less true of other societies as well. It's entirely possible to be an unauthentic, unreflective, bored, mediocre Catholic. It's entirely possible to be a self-serving nationalist, right? The virtue of liberal societies, and I don't think liberal societies are perfect. I have a different alternative that I think would be more interesting and ultimately more fulfilling. But the virtue of liberal societies is exactly what Mills articulated, that it allows people various different opportunities to engage in what he called experiments in living. And we draw upon the resources that others have developed in their own experiments in living to then try to deliberate upon what is the best possible life to live for a human being. And I don't think these opportunities are available in reactionary societies where there's such an emphasis on homogeneity for the sake of political order. These are societies that are committed to a kind of uniformity that I don't think any truly alive person would want to be a part of.
That's well put. And we'll just do the last question here from Dee. And this is a very broad question, and I'm not entirely sure if we actually have time to really address it appropriately. But Dee asks, is postmodernism replacing all ideas in the current age? And I guess we can sort of interpret what that means a little bit. Dee, did you want to clarify the question at all? I guess we could modify it to ask, does postmodernism does it in some sense color all ideas today? Like, are there ideas? It's a cultural condition, but can we really say that any ideas today don't make reference to that condition, and therefore, are there any? Is any culture or is any politics, what have you, not postmodern today?
I think so, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I often point out is that the odd thing is, just as the political right is enjoying its own postmodern moment, the political left is gradually starting to abandon it, right? And you see this with the resurgence of what I sometimes call millennial socialism or Gen Z socialism, which tends to be entirely about committing yourself to certain kind of universalistic theories about class exploitation, for example, and the need to economically reorganize society and rejuvenate democracy, and so on and so forth. And you don't see these people using the same kind of rhetorical and intellectual strategies that you would expect from a postmodern politics. And some of this is actually quite self-conscious. Right? Now, whether that means we're going to see the postmodern epoch left behind, I really can't say, and I really don't know. Right? I mean, that's, as you pointed out, too big a question for anyone to answer. And it's also not really a question somebody can answer before it's actually happened. Right? But I don't think postmodernity is going to be with us forever. Frankly, I'd like to see the back of it sooner rather than later. And I think that the way to go would be to look to these universalistic forms of millennial and Gen Z socialism, see what they have to offer, and perhaps they'll come up with a new kind of ideological space that will be more satisfying and gratifying than the postmodern epoch that hopefully we'll leave behind.
And Dee just specifies American politics. Is there anything you would particularize to there, or would you say this is pretty universally applicable? Globally,
what I just said is universally applicable. Now, I think certainly, like in many Anglo-American countries, what I just talked about with this kind of millennial socialism applies. Right? Whether that's the same is true in other developed states, I don't know. I can speak to the Mexican experience, for example, and say that many people were enthused by AMLO's rise to power. I've been disappointed by him now subsequently, but I do think that you are starting to see new kinds of politics emerge in different parts of the world, driven primarily by young people. A lot of these don't have the same kind of postmodern characteristics that their antecedents did. And I imagine that's because we're gradually starting to move away from this epoch and towards something new. Whether that's true or not, ask me in 10 years.
Okay. I'm actually, it's too bad that we didn't lead with that, because that's actually really fascinating. I want to know more. But I'll let you go now, because I know you want to go have dinner and you have some work to do. So thank you very much, Professor McManus, for joining us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If anyone has any questions, they can always email me at mattmcmanus300@gmail.com or add me at @malpaulfroth on Twitter. And I'll be able to answer questions then.
Okay. And can I add that to the description so they can all just...
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. All right. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. by all means, I would love to have you on again, but that's of course at your leisure.
Sure. I wouldn't mind. I enjoyed this. So yeah, just let me know. Maybe we can advance or so.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. This has been great. And thanks to the audience for asking questions and being engaged. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.